you're doing to help further the humane education movement, and I thank you for going along that journey this morning and starting the day 2 off well. I was just told one more reminder, which is our scholarship recipients should check in at the check-in table at 2:15 today to get their monies and exchange their receipts. So scholarships go to the check-in table at 2:15 today. That's it. That's all I have, and I'm going to step off and turn it over to Dana, and she's going to introduce our keynote. So thank you very much, and good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this year's conference, Bernard Unti. Bernie is Senior Policy Advisor and Special Assistant to the President and CEO of the Humane Society of the United States and works on a wide range of strategic, policy, program, and communications priorities. An historian by training, he is the author of Protecting All Animals, a 50-year history of the Humane Society of the United States, and the co-author of a widely cited 2003 essay with Bill DeRosa, Humane Education, Past, Present, and Future. His interests include the evolution of humane attitudes towards animals, the history and sociology of the animal protection movement, the development of pet keeping, animal sheltering, and the kindness to animals ethic, the humane education of children, and the place of animal protection within American philanthropy. The title of his keynote address is up there, Humane Education, Past Perspectives, and the Path Ahead. Please join me in welcoming Bernie Unti.
Oh, techie. Let's see. All right, there we go. Thank you, Dana. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I want to thank everyone who made it possible for me to be with you here today. I've wanted to talk to the members of this group for a long time, and I can say with complete honesty, there's nowhere else I'd rather be this morning than with you. I'll say more about it, but I want to say up front, I want to thank you for being part of this community of practice, humane education. For my money, it's the single most important area of humane work. This should be an uncontroversial view in our field, but strangely it isn't. But I know you agree with me, and it's truly an honor for me to spend time with you today. I hope that I'll keep my talk within bounds so we have time for some questions, and I'll be around all day to talk. I've really been encouraged learning about some of the programs you're all involved in. This is a real whirlwind tour through the early history of humane education and a hasty treatment of some mid-range and contemporary stuff, but I think in the case of the latter material, it's things you're going to be somewhat familiar with yourself. So thanks again, and let's get going. You might recognize the Bell of Justice, conjured up by Longfellow's poem, the Bell of Atri, about the mistreated horse who goes to the town square in Italy and rings the bell of justice to protest his mistreatment at the hands of an indifferent owner. Just one of the many tropes and images you're going to see today that have been popular with animal protectionists and humane education advocates in the past, and to some extent right up to the current day. We could say about kindness to animals and humane education that there have always been people interested or committed in one way or another to kindness. It's something of a minority tradition, but obviously it's present in the great religions of the world. We can find it in ancient and not so ancient writings, but to see the kind of quickening of animal protection and the human education concept, you've got to go to the early modern era and then really into the 18th century. We could identify a few constitutive dimensions of that quickening: the cult of sensibility, This emerged from a debate between the Cambridge latitudinarian divines about the nature of humankind, whether humans were innately good or something else. They were responding to some extent to Thomas Hobbes, who, if you were in philosophy class that day, said that life is nasty, brutish, and short, had a very dim view of human nature. But the latitudinarian divines argued that no, humankind created in the image of God and in the spirit of God, like God himself, is good. Around this ideology developed a kind of way of thinking about how people can be good. And from that emerged the concept of the humane person. Humane used to be an adjective that described all things human, like Locke's essay on humane understanding about human psychology. But in the wake of this debate over sensibility, it came to describe certain kinds of characteristics of persons who could see beyond themselves, who had sympathy for others beyond themselves, who had a regard for the needs, the interests, the suffering of others, and manifested it in all kinds of ways. John Locke came along, of course, and swept this debate away to some extent by arguing that humans are born, again from philosophy, if you didn't skip that day, which I did, tabula rasa, as a blank slate, emphasizing the importance of nurture, environment, socialization, that people aren't born one way or the other, but that they're product of tremendous personal and social influences around them. We'll see how important this becomes for animal protection and childhood education in just a moment. Then you had Benthamite utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham, the English jurisprudent and philosopher. You frequently get emails from people, and at the end they got a long quote from Bentham's principles of legislation at the bottom. The crucial point is, it's not can they talk, can they reason, but rather can they suffer. And of course, Bentham devoted a mere footnote to the question of animals, but it winds up being a very important one historically, because he saw that his philosophy had implications for the treatment of animals. Utilitarianism, of course, aggregates benefits versus disadvantages and suffering to try to develop a kind of moral calculus about what's right. And the most important, I suppose, contemporary philosopher in the Benthamite tradition would be Peter Singer, who happens to have written a lot about animal protection. So there's an interesting question there. Another influence is late 18th century and 19th century evangelicalism. Small l, liberal, large E, evangelicalism. It's different from the kind of evangelicalism we know and think about in the United States today. We'll define it a little bit today as we go. Evangelicalism relied more on the Old Testament than the New Testament, which is helpful on the cruelty to animals question, because there's very little in the New Testament useful on the treatment of animals. It believed in a notion of individual perfection, so that the world got better as we ourselves got better, and again, a kind of an aggregate process. We all get better together. And evangelicalism had a strong impulse to kind of project its values into the public sphere, so that in England, for example, in the Parliament, William Wilberforce is the most notable evangelical. Today, his example could be seen as a problematic one, particularly here in the United States, of course, where we have some tensions about the introjection of religious values into the political sphere, but it's important in terms of the rise of animal protection. We have the spectatorial nature of sympathy, the offensive nature of cruelty that people could commonly see on the street, the idea that someone should do something about this, that, or the other cruelty that comes into play. And we even have early modern capitalism arguably playing its role, as the historian Thomas Haskell suggests. Capitalism institutionalizing a kind of degree of contract got people thinking about their obligations to distant others, people whom they might never meet, but to whom they had firm obligations and duties. And some believed that could include African American enslaved people, extended towards animals, various distant others and other parties. Locke, we've talked about in terms of tabula rasa, and in 1693 he wrote a book, Thoughts Concerning Education. And remarkably, it describes this notion of environmentalism or nurture that we're talking about. He admonished parents that they should chastise childhood cruelty and cruel behavior by their children. And I bet everybody can answer why, but I'll answer for the sake of time. It was the notion that such cruelty should be modified, chastised, lest those impulses in a child flourish, develop, and make him or her tend to be more cruel, both to animals and to other human beings. A pretty commonplace understanding in our field. Now it's more empirically demonstrated, the link, the graduation hypothesis, the link between cruelty to animals and interpersonal violence. And other people stated it previously from Locke, but I think he states it most powerfully and most significantly. This coincided with the rise of a robust publishing industry, and Locke's insight basically created or prompted the proliferation of little chapbooks and didactic tales for children, reprinted all over the transatlantic world in English, French, German, well before there was even an animal protection movement itself. Really an interesting insight, because of course movements don't always start things. They frequently coalesce or around robust cultural impulses, discourses, debates, discussions, etc. And that's certainly true for animal protection itself. And of course, these novels didn't just deal with kindness to animals, but the kindness to animals lesson was deeply embedded in many of these stories and chapbooks for children, because of course it's so easy to enact standards of good behavior, rituals of proper behavior, care, due regard, a kind of pedagogy of care with respect to animals, and of course to transfer them in later life to adult interaction. And in a society in which many people didn't read, but they could see and they could observe, you can find tremendous examples of the cruelty to animals question popping up in all sorts of material and literary culture. This is Hogarth's 4 Stages of Cruelty, executed right smack in the middle of the 18th century. It's the story of Tom Nero. There are 4 panels. I encourage you to take a good long look at it and read 1 or 2 of the essays on it, because each one is filled with tremendous images of common cruelties that people might see. And the whole tableau together constitutes a kind of a humane education lesson. It's a cautionary tale. It clues the escalation hypothesis, as we'll see. So of course Tom and other boys are engaged in childhood cruelties of various kinds, common in the street. There's all sorts of mischief and things going on in there. He graduates to be a horseman in Carter. He's mistreating a horse. Again, common cruelties surround him. Animals are very present in the urban environment. This leads him to mislead his lady friend and to commit murder. He's apprehended. He's paying a cost, in a sense, for his own escalation from relatively benign childhood cruelties to very dangerous antisocial and violent behavior. And then finally the comeuppance. He's hanged at the gallows. He's dissected by the new class of doctors and scientists in episode 4, and in one final indignity, dogs feed on his entrails. To a happier slide. We've talked about childhood socialization in connection with Locke. And there's another interesting Lockean connection, because of course Locke was one of the theorists of the American Revolution and our own experiment in democratic republicanism. Our founding fathers were men of real limitations. I think that's very clear and should always be stated, but some of the basic premises were good ones as they've been extended. In any case, they believed that the American Republic required people, of course they were white propertied males originally, people of a virtuous nature. We were entrusting power and authority to others as our representatives, and a healthy politic depended on their virtuous nature. So, thinking about Locke's admonition about childhood cruelty and the need to stamp it out and to socialize children properly, we can see that kindness to animals is not a trivial matter. It's highly relevant to the democratic experiment, certainly in the United States, because a boy in particular whose childhood cruelty went unchecked could wind up, in the worst case, becoming a tyrant over us all. It turns out this is, of course, a very abstract proposition, not one likely to find us at any time in the United States, past, present, or future. In the period before the Civil War, the kindness to animals lesson was enacted again and again in the domestic sphere, which was the sphere, to a great extent, of women. America and much of the world operated under a kind of gendered ideology. Men populated the banknote world, the rough and tumble world of politics and the public sphere. Women reigned over the hearth. And here again we see that kind of correlation between gender and essential female nature and the kindness lesson. It's taking place in households, farms, other contexts in which animals are commensals. They live with people, and so they become the instruments of children's development very profoundly in their kind of rise to adulthood and taking their proper place in society. And 1830 to 1860 was a period of tremendous reform in the United States, driven in part by this liberal evangelical impulse, this desire to improve the world and society itself. Anti-slavery, of course, was the biggest of all reforms, but there were others. There was temperance, the effort to stamp out the drinking of alcohol. There was capital punishment, the abolition of capital punishment or corporal punishment in the schools, flogging in the Navy. There was dress reform. There was women's rights, the Seneca Falls Declaration of 1849, I guess that would have been. So a period of tremendous reform. What happens is that by the 1850s, slavery kinds of crowds the others off of the agenda. It becomes such an indigestible problem in the American politic, in American society. But you don't see an animal protection movement. You still don't see an animal protection movement in the United States, even though you do see the kindness ethic. You will find some exemplars of liberal evangelicalism who straddle animal protection and other causes. So here we have Harriet Beecher Stowe and Lydia Maria Child, who participated in both movements. And Stowe is really the best example of the liberal evangelical reformer. Not many people read Uncle Tom's Cabin these days, and I don't suppose that they need to, but Lincoln said when he met Stowe, "Hey, it's good to meet the little old lady that kicked off the war." Something to that effect. Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't. Can't believe everything he published on the internet. But of course she hadn't predicted a war or called for a war. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a novel of transformation. It's precisely the model of individuals changing, having a change of heart, and then in the aggregate producing a kind of a more perfect world. And of course it's slaves and some whites who are the exemplars of a kind of perfect Christian kindness, compassion, and behavior, while the slaveholders and their supporters are the dissolute, depraved, depraved class. So Stowe really exemplifies this, maybe better for our purposes than, say, Wilberforce, because Stowe and Child actually wrote kindness to animals lessons in their own writings, again, before the war and after the war, quite remarkably. Of course, people could see all kinds of cruelties in that era. Some historians used to say animal protection emerged because animals disappeared and there was a kind of a nostalgic interest in them. But the fact is, an urbanizing industrial society sort of swallowed them up. So in any American metropolis in the mid-19th century, you would see cattle drives, pig drives right through the street. There was no zoning. You could see a slaughterhouse right next to a schoolhouse. You saw dogs and cats loose all over. There was plenty of food and wastes and offal, which they could survive upon. And of course, the whole world operated with the horse. The horse is at the center of the economy as a means of transport, a conveyance, and so there were animal welfare problems galore to be found for a sensitized population. And so we come to the origins of the movement. Why does it start in 1866 with the first SPCAs being formed in the latter half of the 1860s? I want to say that you had to have the abolition of slavery to really see things kick off. War bottled up a lot of the energy. The question of how people treat their chattel property, be it human chattel, slaves, or animals, was a difficult one to work in the courts. We do have about a dozen laws in American states before 1866, and some of them show a certain evolution of thought towards real protection centered on the interests of animals, but there are none present in the states of the Confederacy, in the southern states. So I think this bears out the idea that you just had to have slavery gone for the issue to surface in a more formal way. And it does. Henry Bergh, George Angel, Caroline Earl White, I like to add Emily Appleton to the mix. In every major city, this idea took off. And of course, in these figures, we can sort of sketch out the classic approaches. They all partook of everything. Bergh in the center was confronting cruelty, very aggressive, imperious, aristocratic type enforcement, a very punitive streak. He's challenging cruelty dramatically, taking advantage of his own celebrity in the New York penny press. Angel, a kind of education, PR impresario in today's language, propagandizing, very big on humane education, and we'll see some of his work in coming slides. Caroline Earl White, a little bit closer to Angel than to Bergh in terms of the education outreach, but also an institution builder, conceived and operated the first animal shelter in the United States with some of the earliest practices that we would now say are kind of the classic practices of animal sheltering, adopting, holding areas, wagons, accoutrement for catching animals, all those kinds of things, improving the processes of euthanasia. We get to education, of course, we have big things going on in the nation swelling with new immigrants, and there's the common school movement, and Horace Mann, he even got a stamp. I wish some animal people would get a stamp. The notion that the schools can be an instrument of human perfectibility, pretty clear. The notion that the schools can be an instrument of assimilation to the United States, again, pretty clear. Also, we note the school as a kind of a guarantor of social order that mitigates destructive impulses, socializes people to the kind of the American way of doing and thinking about things. This is the context in which Angel and others began to advance humane education in a more formal way. And this image on the left pairs Angel with the Reverend Thomas Timmins of Portsmouth, England, who had been doing some of this work in the UK, where animal protection organized in the 1820s. And Timmins had also worked with the Band of Hope, which were education units focused around the temperance movement. Today, you know, we think of temperance as kind of dowdy old ladies. They're just angry that somebody somewhere might actually be having a good time knocking down a beer, you know, with friends, and we don't give them the credit they deserve. They deserve a little more credit because if alcohol was very potent, people were knocking down that whiskey and drams of rum and so forth in the morning, going off to work in the new industrial economy, working the looms or the machinery while some other fellow's head was in there. You know, it could be a potentially dangerous practice. What Angel and Timmins did was to bring the organizing principles of the Bands of Hope to the kindness question, the Band of Mercy. And they weren't alone in Philadelphia. Caroline Earl White and her colleagues at the women's branch of the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals also launched Humane Education. Berg and the ASPCA gave it a little bit of show too. I don't think their approach really came anywhere near the success of Angel and White in terms of doing this. But it became, Humane Education, I mean, pretty constitutive of the work of these early societies on top of everything else that they were doing. And really, it's one of the legs of the stool if you think about the kind of formation of the SPCA concept in the United States. Here's a reward of merit. You'd give them out to students for recitation or good behavior or so forth. And this is a classic one from MSPCA, from Landseer's painting, Waiting for Master. This notion that images and lines of poetry could provide a little uplift, even if you just showed the pictures, had some value. Here's very early ones. I just picked these up about a year ago from the Philadelphia group, the Young American Humane Union, that White and some of her friends formed. And each of these cards has a little recitation on the back about the concept. And you can see faithfulness, mercy, basically it's character education. We could add all kinds of other words, but they understood what humane education was about, more or less in the way that we do today. You could have kids sign a pledge. Here they're executing a pledge. There's a little sheet where you sign your name on it. You could give literature out yourself. You could get out and hand it out to people working with horses in the street or to other children. They had their own little Band of Mercy star. You could identify it, so there was a kind of a identity formation within this community that came up around all that. And the biggest thing Angel did was he pirated an edition of Anna Sewell's Black Beauty, the classic story by the already then late Anna Sewell, an invalid and Quaker, by a birthright Quaker, who wrote this classic tale of one horse's experience spiraling down into bad circumstances, but then eventually finding peace and happiness again. And you'll note that Angel, in issuing a fabulous number of copies for use in schools and churches and all kinds of contexts in the United States, explicitly dubbed it the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Horse. You frequently see some facile comparisons between the treatment of animals and, say, the treatment of slaves or African Americans or some other parties, in our history. I think you have to be careful in making these comparisons. They're not little slaves, and it's not exactly the way it was for these other oppressed groups, but what is similar is the framing, the opposition to the culture of violence, to the culture of cruelty. And in that kind of New England reformist culture that produced someone like Angel, You know, he knew his audience, and he understood how to cast this book and kind of give it lift. And it was a fabulous publishing success. You can still get your own copy. They're fairly cheaply produced and don't hold up well, but you can get your own copies for show and tell on eBay or ABE or places like that. And of course, there were dog analogs. Angel advertised for a dog version, which produced Beautiful Joe. There was a cat version, Daisy, all sorts of animals. There's a kind of genre of animal autobiography, and there is in the current literature of humane education, too, in which animals kind of deliver the bill of indictments. In fact, there's a new novel by Ralph Nader, the consumer advocate, called Animal Envy, which is kind of a congress of animals indicting humanity for various cruelties. So this, too, is kind of a long-established tradition, both in humane education and in adult literature. It's valuable for us to talk about this concept I call the indivisibility of cruelty, the coattail effect, the degree to which concern for animals was harnessed or yoked to other concerns of the 19th century evangelical worldview, first and foremost. There was child protection. It's a little different than most people know in terms of the origin story of the anti-cruelty societies. Child protection is not an entirely benign kind of movement in American history, so I'm very careful about it, but there are very close connections. I think it's most important for our purposes to think about it in terms of the vulnerability, the shared vulnerability of children and animals, their innocence, their dependence on adults and right-thinking others, and their inability to defend themselves, basically. This image, which we'll talk about in a moment, conjures some of that up. It's Why Can't You Talk, based on the work of the English lithographer George Holmes. And you have the kind of intersubjectivity, what they say in culture studies, the tie sign. There's a connection between child and animal here. Something is going on. Neither one understands why the other one can't talk. This is a movement. The journal Our Dumb Animals captured the notion that animals couldn't talk. All of us human beings know that someday we will have voices, we will be their voices, we can be the voices. They will still be innocent, vulnerable, needing our protection. That's the story that the viewer supplies. This is a very powerful image throughout American culture. You'll see it in humane education textbooks, but you'll also see it for a shoe store advertisement, for a New York Tailor advertisement, pictures of Uplift, even stereopticon cards, a powerful, powerful image in the field. We also talk again about temperance. I've already said what I like to say about temperance in terms of its legitimacy as a social movement in the United States. Temperance was the most important example of what we call social feminism in historical studies. That's feminism or women's activism not explicitly tied to, say, getting the vote, to political action, but rather to kind of a projection of women's values into the public sphere and the broader sphere. And we'll talk about Frances Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but it was a tremendously influential movement in the 1870s, 1880s, in the latter portion of the 19th century, and certainly the strongest expression of social feminism. Child protection, temperance, animal protection have an underlying theme in common that, you know, I think everybody could guess over time, but again, in the interests of moving ahead, I have to state it explicitly. They comprise a covert, a silent discourse, an understudied discussion of male violence and the problem of male violence. The man who was cruel to animals, neglected his children, was dissolute, a drunkard, didn't tend to his work, neglected or abused his wife. He was a social menace. All of these signs, lack of interest in your kids, disrespect for your wife, neglect or failure to care for your animals, isolated or demarcated this person and marked him out as a very serious social threat. Again, this is much deeper than, say, be kind to animals. This ties this concern and the process, the actions, so the function of humane education to some very important social concerns. When it comes to the interface with temperance, we have an amazing crossover figure in Mary Lovell, who founded the Department of Mercy. Under Frances Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they sought to ally themselves with every kind of movement they thought was allied, that was a part of this discussion of proper male behavior, for example, because it's really a problem with boys and men to a very great extent. Most of the literature targets boys. We understand that even today, in terms of individual acts of cruelty, there is a gender question, right? So it's there. But Lovell managed this little unit, the Department of Mercy, so it was a very self-conscious engagement between the movements. There's Frances Willard, and she had a cat, Toots, who was again sort of an interface. Toots would appear in the Union Signal. There were photographs. There was a book about Toots and other animals. He was himself a very cognizable figure in terms of Willard's identity as a leader and someone who connected. They cast Toots himself as a soldier for the cause of temperance and kindness to animals, so kind of a minor celebrity or even a proxy for his mistress at times. And these two movements, I love talking about this, they literally inscribed their values on the landscape. Maybe some of you live in towns where you still see an old water trough or a fountain and so forth, put in place by the Temperance Society or the SPCA or the Humane Society. And of course they wanted to put these out there because the barman, the saloon owner, had a trough of water or a little fountain right outside so he could lure Patty or the driver in for drinks, and the horse could get a little water on the outside. The whole idea was to put fresh, health-providing, good water in front of everyone. So these served all kinds of people, and of course it literally inscribed the values, be merciful, be kindness, on our landscape in ways that you still will see. And of course these movements had an exemplar. There was someone who embodied their notion of proper male behavior. It was Lincoln, who grew up in an era of rough masculinity, may or may not have been involved in hunting, certain cruelty. I've heard him refereeing cockfights. I've heard all sorts of things about him. But we also know on very strong authority that Lincoln was in school, gave a very early declamation about cruelty to animals, and there are very good substantiated instances of his kindness. And importantly, the kindness didn't render him soft when it came time to be tested in the fires of war and kindness. It didn't make him a pacifist, a softy. It didn't feminize him, for lack of a better way of putting it, so that he couldn't act as the leader of our nation in a moment of crisis. Now we come into the 20th century. We have to move ahead a little bit. The progressive era. Chronology is always arbitrary, but I'm talking about the period 1890 to 1920. It's the emergence of a modern America, a national market, fully industrialized nation, urbanization, more people living in cities than not, high immigration, including from non-Anglo-Saxon type countries, rationalization, the application of order, technocratic order, not excuse-making, but rational thinking about industry, how to operate markets, etc. Modernization. And it has many exemplars, but we could take a look at Roosevelt as kind of a champion of some of these trends, although he also had concerns about the urbanizing nation, the loss of contact with nature, etc. And the progressive era had a tremendous focus on youth and character building. This is the era in which modern social work formed. social work that actually separated child protection from animal protection. One of the reasons these little societies that did both child protection and animal protection, they lost their child protection remit in this period, was because child welfare became a central preoccupation of the American state. And it still is if you think about government agencies working on these questions, whereas animal welfare was left to the private sector, the philanthropic sector, and still is. What was the movement doing to institutionalize humane education in this period? We'll take a quick look at it. Well, you needed a class of professional humane educators, and some came along. This is just a joke, but I had already used my one good image of an educator somewhere else, so that's Professor 4567 in his class. You needed books, and animal societies under the aegis of American Humane Association and other groups produced a number of readers with images, poems, music, uplift, again, all early 20th century or late 19th century works. You needed projects. This is a very Monty Python-ish kind of looking piece, but I just love it, making bird houses, you know, in shop class or whatever. Everyone's got one to take home. Where's my friend from the San Francisco SPCA? A little lantern slide advertising a pet show. Be kind to animals, another one of my favorites, the South Carolina printer Henry Lewis, who kind of came up with the slogan, be kind to animals, just sort of let's all just shout it to the hilltops, be kind, an idea that's now 100 years old in terms of that sort of sloganeering. The Boy Scouts, totally an experiment in progressive era socialization of youth. Boys and girls, but importantly for our purposes, boys. A merit badge, which I guess they just discontinued 3 or 4 years back, but learning kindness and how to treat animals, first aid. You even had political champions like Governor Baxter of Maine, an amazing exemplar of humane values, who supported humane education, sent a letter annually to students in Maine in the 1920s, took his dog Gary to work, lowered the flag to half-mast at the state capitol, catching a lot of grief when Gary passed away, and just really being a strong advocate in a period where we don't think there was much going on. You even had a major gift, and this is the kind of what if. A fellow gave $100,000 to Columbia University to study humane education and how it could work and how to advance it in society. Like many universities, Columbia just never really delivered. The money kind of disappeared into the general kitty, and they never really did anything with it, which is unfortunate because they could have carried out some interesting investigations, just like the sort of thing we'd like to see today in terms of measuring impact, figuring out how to deliver humane education properly. It's just one of the earliest examples of a bequest in our field kind of going off in the wrong direction, which is unfortunately all too common. You had, beginning in the late 19th century, arguments about vivisection and dissection in the schools. A lot of distrust over physiologists and their use of animals, and the notion that in education, children would be exposed and desensitized. This was a very kind of simple notion of human psychology, that the mere exposure could turn someone very bad, but there's a little something to it. So you had Albert Leffingwell and others pressing this issue very powerfully in terms of the use of animals in classrooms. You even had a push for compulsory humane education, and I know people have talked to me about this from time to time. Can you resurrect these laws? They got them on the books in a number of states. There's the one for Maine. They even had a little implementation guidebook with Governor Baxter's Gary on the cover, but you didn't really have enforcement, and all these amounted to what we today would call an unfunded mandate. I'm not saying there isn't potential use for these kinds of laws in the future, but you know the landscape of contemporary education and politics today. But it is a strong expression of the movement's efforts and prioritization of this concern. You also had a nexus in this era with nature study. Roosevelt, Liberty Hyde Bailey, and others were very worried about people's loss of contact with nature. So nature study emerged as a way of keeping young people connected to the benefits of nature. They had, like humane educators, some of the same problems. Teacher training issues, integration, blending, correlation challenges, but there were also differences. Humane education was often accused of being anthropomorphic, kind of emotional. Nature study was a bit more utilitarian, a little softer on animal experimentation. And here you can see the door sort of closing on humane education as we have the era of a modern school system. It's displaced by elementary school science, which is shaped more powerfully by utilitarian values, use-oriented values, and nature study, and less by the kindness ethic. But you still had the bands of mercy under the management of many regional societies of great prominence, and here, of course, you see the pinbacks, the badges, the medallions. There's a tremendous material culture that exists today as remnants of this work of humane education, for poster art contests, essay contests, pamphleteering contests, all sorts of things. You had a little army of people. This is the American Humane Education Society, MSPCA, formed it. They kept these folks out on the road talking. A couple of these folks are African American. We can learn a little bit about them, like Richard Carroll. There's a good little literature on him in South Carolina. And of course, they respected to some extent the boundaries in segregated society here and there in the country, but they did try to reach out to people of color in various contexts. So I think this movement looks pretty good in terms of its engagement and broad spirit of engagement with all people at the time. And they could get some pretty big crowds. This is one big hootenanny kind of crowd in Kansas City around 1913. For a Band of Mercy meeting. I don't know the full context. I should do a little more to find out. Sometimes these meetings got stoked up by the appearance of an animal celebrity like Jim Key. Actually, Morgan Freeman's going to star as this guy here in a couple years in a film about Jim Key, and there's a pretty good book by Mimi Rivas. It's kind of a parlor trick, you know, accounting, spelling horse, but trained through kind methods. And of course, the horse was still on the street, so beautiful Jim Key was one of a number. But you can see this one here is issued by the Women's SPCA, a little token for getting in to see him. So, you know, again, something that gave it a little boost. Parades, Boy Scout parades, humane education parades, children, again, standing up for animals in various contexts, poster contests, music, all that stuff. What happens to sort of slow the pace down? Well, World War I, you know, war can be transformative in culture, but it also can interrupt a lot of things, and certainly the militarism of the World War I era damaged the humane movement, particularly in its associations with anti-militaristic forces. And in fact, the movement got involved in the war effort. You know, let's help the horse to help the soldier, and a certain momentum was lost. Here are some posters tied to that effect. You also had some big trends going on in that time. The passing of the horse, veterinary medicine and animal protection both are orientating away from the horse and from other animals they focused on. They're getting bogged down with municipal animal control as their principal concern. A lot of the cruelties they opposed are under a certain amount of regulation, but these movements weren't so good at dealing with challenges associated with the industrialization of animal use and what I call Fordism. That's the pairing of demand and supply, say in the meat industry and scientific product testing, etc. It's stoking up demand. Remember, Ford said, I want to build a product in my factory that everybody who works there can own. Let's start talking about the legacy of some of these things we've spoken of. I think this era, 19th century, early 20th, does have a legacy. I think it reinforced the notion that kindness to animals is an important attribute of a well-adjusted person. How else can we explain that understanding as such a commonplace in human psychology and in our common understanding. I think there are always, too, some entrepreneurs and cultural tailing. Even though the movement subsides to a great extent, you still have some moral entrepreneurs. This is a favorite of mine, Ethel Beebe, who decided that the Mother Goose tales were defective from a humane education perspective, so she sent as a project explicitly to replace them with her own set of tales, and she lucked out because she got John Gruhl as her illustrator, the creator of Raggedy, later to become the creator of Raggedy Ann and Andy, so she lives on in a sense because of his own celebrity. I actually know an old lady, 95, who used to be her neighbor in Westport, Connecticut, so this is not all that far apart from our own time. We come to the early 20th century movement. These are mostly HSUS or HSUS allied figures. They were part of a kind of a revitalization of animal protection. Humane education was certainly on their minds. Hope Sawyer, Fred Myers, Dale Hilton, Edith Good and Alice Morgan Wright, Helen Jones, but there animal rights, a kind of broad consciousness on these questions surfacing, so the movement is revitalized, including bringing in people from other movements that kind of raise the intersectionality questions to cast animal protection as a true social justice movement, as more and more people are doing. What are the historical lessons that are relevant for us? There have been periods where humane education has converged with larger goals, assimilation, character formation, etc. We've talked about the difficulty of policing individual cruelties, like a carter beating his horse, and something like the kind of cruelties you'd get in the packing houses or the Union stockyard, a challenge for the movement, and a challenge for educators because there's a certain social sanction attached to some of these practices that makes it difficult to develop a critique via education itself. Let's see where we're at. The promotion of the nexus between cruelty and interpersonal violence, obviously that's still with us. I think if there was a way in which the 19th century movement failed, and our challenge would be to really institutionalize within schools of education, for example, and other locations and sites, the necessary resources to support humane education and its professional development. So where are we heading? Well, we have some challenges. Education is a highly politicized arena. Standards, lack of space, blending, lack of social space. But there are some opportunities, and you guys know this better than me: service learning, pro-social learning, character ed, environmental ed, diversity education, intersectionality. The cruelty to animals nexus. This is the society cares a lot about this issue still, the kind of escalation problem. I think there are some opportunities, and I see lots of flourishing programs out there at the grassroots level. You're involved in some of these things. I want to talk a little bit about why humane ed fits into a positive vision for this movement, animal protection more broadly. There's the biophilia notion that we have a deep connection with animals. There's the zoopolis notion that we need to reconceptualize our whole set of social relations with each other and animals in a way that includes them in a deep sense and in a positive sense, because animal rights is a movement that scolds. Don't do this, don't do that, stop this, stop it, stop it, stop it. But what is this movement for? Humane education starts from a better premise than many other elements of our work, and I think it can really be part of the positive agenda for animals. I'm real excited about the human behavior change paradigms. How do you get people to behave better? And there are some big education programs that don't necessarily involve kids. Here are a couple I've been involved with after Katrina. Pets. We lose. You get people to show up and take advantage of the programs. relinquished their reservations about spay-neuter. I'm also excited about the sweep of values in our time. Steven Pinker has assailed the notion that somehow the world is getting worse, it's more violent, etc., pointing out that in some areas things are getting much, much better, and I think humane education has a chance to kind of connect to that spirit. What's holding us back? Research, the metric question, no real support within the academic field of animal studies, no real support from foundations, very tepid support from the big national groups, right? National organizations, here the train is leaving without them. They don't value youth engagement. I worked for an organization that has had a strong purchase on humane education in the past, but it's unfortunately true that, as with every movement, there are ebbs and flows, there are other priorities, and our major groups have really de-emphasized their commitment to humane education, which is something I regret. I fear it's because the leadership doesn't perceive the value of youth engagement, and even the value of youth engagement on adults and on real big problems in society itself. That's why, and I'm really encouraged, in a sense, this brings me right to you and this audience, because I asked myself coming out here, do we need the national organizations on this question? And I think you're answering that question. It's sort of the let a thousand flowers blossom approach. Community-level SPCAs, if they can afford it, they do know the value of humane ed. Those programs do convey to their work. An organization working on lobbying or big cruelty cases or disaster deployments or something, as ASPCA or HSUS might do, they may not see how humane ed conveys very directly to their work, their fundraising, their brand, etc. But local societies do. So I think we want to keep working to find resources for locals, support the organizations at the national level that support humane ed, support validation, the professional certification programs, solve these problems through this community of practice and others. We could say that maybe even the animal shelter, as it evolves in the future, will become more of a center again for these things as other problems like companion animal overpopulation get mitigated. I'm also encouraged about the expanding global context, because in places where we're trying to pass a law or something where there hasn't been a law, education is the necessary precursor to that kind of work. So humane ed programs like this one in Vietnam become extremely important. So let's answer the call. I think we left about 5 minutes for a little back and forth. I'm sorry I had to race through so much stuff, but I really wanted to give a good picture, and I hope we can have a couple questions now and talk some more during the day, and I thank you so much. Oh, this is working again, yeah. Take it away from him. Okay. You can state it. I'll restate the question if you like.
Hi, I'm wondering, representing HSUS, how you would say that HSUS is supporting humane education.
Well, HSUS, over the course of its 60-year history, has founded a separate division focusing on humane ed, developed and showed the value and helped to validate professional humane education materials, ran a magazine, associated teacher training, things of that nature, carried the flag for a very long time. So I think there's a sort of a historical legacy there that's very clear. HSUS is not hostile to humane education, and not even indifferent. Humane education is kind of like baseball, apple pie, and Chevrolet. Everybody's for it, kind of, but there's a question of paying for it. Many groups function on the basis of what's raising the money, what's bringing the money in, what do our donors care about, and they set their priorities. Finite resources are a big factor. You or others here might think they've got all the resources, they can do everything, but the fact is they actually can't, any more than we can in our own personal budgets do everything. Right now, we have a lot of people in the donor base. They're interested in factory farming and farm animals. That's where the energy is. There are people interested in effective altruism. You got to show that it matters to animals and massive numbers of animals. And you can't really say, hey, humane education, we kindled the flame of kindness and compassion in the hearts of 100,000 students. It's not really susceptible to that kind of measurement. So, you know, I think HSUS, ASPCA, AHA, Massachusetts SPCA, there might be some others, they've definitely pulled back on their commitments on this front. It's something I regret. I'm myself at odds with many of my colleagues in the field on this question, but I'm also confident that one day humane education will be ascendant once again. Look at our political moment right now. We think we're in the midst of a political crisis in the United States for reasons we all know. But I'd argue we're really in the midst of an educational crisis first and foremost. So I'm confident that more and more people will come to believe that and see that and will do more about it. But I do feel now more than ever that it's going to be a bubble up from the grassroots in our field. Yes?
How many people are here from schools, not with the Humane Society per se?
How many people from schools? Looks like we got about 5 or 6 people. Did you have a question on that score?
I'm just sort of sitting here freaking out because, as you know, I feel like there's a way to leverage all of this into curriculum that could really be happening right now, even as the phenomenon you're talking about is, because there's a whole bunch of, all the needs that, you just took us through history and showed us how these needs led to this kind of education. Really, we're kind of in a very similar place again in the public schools of trying to do this like ethical education and anti-bullying stuff and all of that. You know, yesterday the Charleston animal shelter people did such a great job talking how they're working really hard to go in. And I just sort of feel like there's an opportunity, but we as educators, I mean, I'm not in the sciences, that's Captain Obvious, how you go in and create, you know, biology kinds of stuff. But I'm in the language arts, but I'm just like, okay, here we go. We've got a lot of wonderful texts and that we can, so I'm just, you know.
Well, your question doesn't answer itself, but we're here to solve this challenge. It did me good last night to talk on the boat, plus y'all some hard partying people, to hear about certain programs people are doing in their own communities. I really was moved by, particularly in light of my observation about the broader commitments of some of the larger organizations. I'm very encouraged by the projects going on in all sorts of communities around the country, and the fact that anyone can get this info if they care to replicate these approaches. We might say we're going to have to solve, how do you penetrate institutions of higher learning, decision-making, networks about curriculum, school systems, etc. That's still a challenge. Maybe even curriculum design, although that's less of a worry to me now. But in terms of the basic action, certainly that built around local SPCAs, local humane groups, rescue groups, etc. The education component can flourish, and it doesn't have to be in the schools alone. It can be in all kinds of other spaces where learning and exchange occurs. Yeah. Oh, you fight it out. I'm not picking either one of them. I'm not picking.
No, just one of the things that we have found out, we are educators, and we at heart have the humane education piece, but we had to find the ticket to get into all schools, and it's the character education piece that we have found that has come with interests of businesses, educators, the funding comes along with it. I would love to say the humane education piece, because that's what we love, because that's the heart of the whole program. But that's what we found as the ticket to work, is to get in, because think of our society right now. We need the character development in our kids,
Right.
our adults. So that's what
No,
we
and
have done, to be able to find the funding and to get into all the classrooms, provide this programming that has the humane component.
I think, in all your programs or in the strategizing for APHE and other groups, you've got to figure out which points of convergence offer the greatest potential. It might be character education right now, but in a decade it might be climate change or the global environmental crisis or the biodiversity loss. It might be the diversity challenge and the diversity framework, treating animals as a kind of the next frontier in diversity in an increasingly diverse nation. There are going to be new alignments and opportunities, and I think it's important for people to stay vigilant and to harness it successfully, as you did in your program in Iowa, which we talked about before.
Unfortunately, we have to end. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It was great to be with you.